There are some names in Hollywood that feel less like a person and more like a feeling. Doris Day was one of those names. Say it out loud, and something warm stirs. Sunlit kitchens, pastel dresses, that voice floating through a radio speaker on a lazy Sunday afternoon. She was the woman America collectively decided to love, and for decades, she made that very easy to do. But feelings, as it turns out, can be the most effective disguise ever invented. For most of the world, Doris Day was a permanent symbol of innocence and joy. But for one man, her only grandson, Ryan Melcher, she was something far more complicated. She was the grandmother he barely got to know, the woman behind a gate he couldn't open, the name on a foundation he was never invited to join. And now, at 41, Ryan is finally speaking, not to tear down a legend, and not to rewrite history, but to fill in the parts that were always left blank. What he has revealed doesn't diminish Doris Day. If anything, it makes her more remarkable, because the woman behind the curtain endured things that would have broken most people and still managed to make the whole world smile. This is the story beneath the story, the one that was hidden for decades. And it starts long before Ryan Melcher was ever born. To understand what Ryan revealed, you first have to understand what the world was allowed to see. Doris Day rose to fame in the late 1940s and spent the next 3 decades becoming one of the biggest stars Hollywood had ever produced. She appeared in more than 39 films, recorded over 650 songs, and by the early 1960s, she was the #1 box office draw in the entire United States, male or female. That alone is a staggering achievement. But the industry didn't just sell her talent. It sold an idea of her. She was marketed as the eternal girl next door. Cheerful, wholesome, uncomplicated. The kind of woman who could make a romantic comedy feel like a warm hug. And audiences, particularly in post-war America, were hungry for exactly that kind of comfort. Doris Day became the answer to a cultural need, and the image stuck so firmly to her that even she struggled to separate herself from it in her later years. But here is what that image concealed. A woman who had survived domestic violence before she was 20 years old. A woman who battled anxiety and depression so severe that she genuinely believed, on more than one occasion, that she was dying from a physical illness when the real cause was emotional collapse. A woman who was financially betrayed by the man she trusted most in the world, her own husband, leaving her with nothing but debt when she should have been enjoying the fruits of a legendary career. A woman who, in her final years, lived not in Hollywood glamour, but in near total seclusion, surrounded by dogs and gates and a silence that her only grandson found impossible to cross. Ryan Melcher grew up knowing the public version of his grandmother. What took him decades to fully process was the private one. Ryan Melcher is the son of Terry Melcher, who was Doris Day's only child. Terry was a highly respected music producer who worked with the Byrds, Paul Revere and the Raiders, and the Beach Boys, among others. He and Doris shared a complicated but genuinely deep bond, and for much of Ryan's childhood, that bond meant he had some connection to his famous grandmother. But those connections grew thinner over time, frayed by circumstances, distance, and the invisible walls that tend to grow up around very famous, very private people. When Terry Melcher passed away from melanoma in November 2004, something shifted permanently. Ryan, who was still a young man at the time, had hoped that the loss of his father might actually bring him and Doris closer together. Grief, after all, has a way of collapsing distance. There were reportedly discussions about a reunion, a quiet dinner where grandmother and grandson might begin to rebuild what time and circumstance had eroded. That dinner never happened. Ryan has spoken about this period with measured, careful pain. He does not dramatize it. He does not perform bitterness. But what comes through clearly is the confusion of a man who reached out toward family and found, instead, a wall. In the years that followed his father's death, Ryan found himself not just emotionally separated from his grandmother, but practically invisible to the world she occupied. He had no role in her foundation. He received no updates about her health. He was not present in her final years. And when Doris Day passed away in May 2019 at the age of 97, Ryan Melcher did not receive a phone call. He did not receive a personal message. He found out the way millions of strangers did through social media. Think about that for a moment. The only living grandson of one of the most beloved entertainers in American history found out she was gone through a Facebook post. That single detail speaks volumes about what had gone wrong and how quietly it had gone wrong over many years. When Ryan has discussed his estrangement from Doris, one name comes up with consistent regularity: Bob Bashara, her longtime business manager. According to Ryan, Bashara held an extraordinary degree of influence over Doris's day-to-day life in her later years, particularly as she became more reclusive and more dependent on those closest to her for managing everything from her finances to her personal relationships. Ryan has alleged that Bashara was not merely a manager, but a gatekeeper, someone who controlled access to Doris with a degree of authority that extended well beyond professional responsibility. He claims that the planned dinner reunion after his father's death was blocked by Bashara's interference. He has also pointed to significant changes in the leadership of the Doris Day Animal Foundation, the organization Doris had built over decades as her primary legacy outside of entertainment. According to Ryan, longtime board members who had been part of the foundation since its early days were gradually removed, replaced by individuals with ties to Bashara rather than to Doris's original vision. These are serious allegations, and they have been disputed. Doris Day's longtime publicist, Charlie Cullen Walters, pushed back on Ryan's narrative, stating that attempts were made to reconnect him with his grandmother, including a direct invitation to celebrate her 90th birthday in 2014. According to Walters, Ryan did not respond to that invitation, a detail that complicates the picture Ryan presents of a man desperately trying to reach a grandmother who was kept away from him by outside forces. There is also the matter of a disclaimer that appeared on Ryan's own professional website at one point, asking people not to contact him about celebrity or Hollywood-related matters. That disclaimer raised questions about whether Ryan himself had, at certain moments, sought distance from the Doris Day connection rather than closeness to it. The full truth is likely something neither side has articulated completely. What seems clear is that the estrangement was real, that it caused genuine pain, and that it was shaped by a combination of factors, some external, some perhaps more personal. What is also clear is that the isolation of Doris Day in her final years was not simply a private choice made by a woman who preferred solitude. It was a condition with consequences, and those consequences fell hardest on the people who cared about her most. To fully understand Ryan's revelations, you have to understand the life Doris Day actually lived. Not the one projected on his cinema screens across the world, but the one happening behind closed doors over the course of 8 extraordinary and often brutal decades. Her first marriage to trombonist Al Jordan in 1941 began when she was just 17 years old and turned violent almost immediately. On their wedding night, Jordan became enraged over something entirely trivial and physically attacked her. The abuse continued throughout the marriage and escalated to a terrifying degree when Doris was 8 months pregnant. Jordan produced a loaded gun and expressed intentions of catastrophic violence toward his wife, their unborn child, and himself. Doris survived that night through sheer presence of mind and emotional endurance that most people will never need to summon. She eventually left the marriage after Jordan began directing his aggression toward their newborn son, Terry. Her second marriage brought disappointment of a quieter but still painful kind. Her husband grew resentful of her rising fame, uncomfortable being identified as Mr. Doris Day, and ended the marriage within a year. She had placed hope in it, and that hope was swiftly returned to her, unopened. Her third marriage, to Martin Melcher in 1951, lasted 17 years and appeared, from the outside, to be the stable partnership she had always needed. Melcher managed her career and her finances, and Doris trusted him entirely. That trust turned out to be catastrophic. When Melcher died suddenly in 1968, Doris discovered that he and his associate, attorney Jerome Rosenthal, had systematically mismanaged and misappropriated her earnings over the course of nearly 2 decades. A fortune estimated at around $150 million had been drained. She was left not just with nothing, but with debt exceeding $500,000. And then she discovered something else. Before his death, Melcher had secretly signed her to a television series, The Doris Day Show, without her knowledge or consent. She had planned to retire from performing. She had finished what she intended to be her final film. Instead, she found herself legally obligated to a project she had never agreed to, with an advance that had already been spent. She had no choice but to work. This is the reality that existed entirely off-screen. The audiences watching The Doris Day Show during its run from 1968 to 1973 saw warmth and humor in that trademark radiant energy. They had no idea that the woman delivering it had recently discovered her financial ruin, was mourning a husband whose betrayal she was still processing, and was showing up to work because she literally could not afford not to. Alongside the external hardships, Doris Day waged a quiet internal war for most of her professional life. During the height of her fame in the 1950s, she experienced episodes of anxiety so severe that she became convinced she was suffering from a serious heart condition. The physical symptoms, racing heart, chest tightness, a sense of overwhelming dread, were real, but their source was psychological rather than physiological. She was experiencing panic attacks at a time when a language for such things barely existed, and the cultural stigma around mental health made seeking help feel impossible for someone in her position.